The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of a suburban town in the interior of the United States. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, was sitting on the front porch of her house, looking at the horizon with a tightness in her chest. Her mind was a storm of confused thoughts and emotions. Suddenly, the familiar sound of her husband John's car engine echoed through the garage. He entered the house with a face burdened by a decision he had made long ago but had kept silent until now. Without looking at Sarah, he began to gather his things, throwing clothes and personal belongings into a suitcase with an urgency that made her feel like the ground was collapsing beneath her feet. "John, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she tried to stay calm. He stopped for a moment, looking at her with cold, distant eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah. I don't want this life. I don't want this child." His words were like knives piercing her heart. Sarah slowly stood up, feeling a wave of despair and fear wash over her. "Please, John, don't go. We need you. I need you. Our child needs you." He just shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "You'll be fine without me. I'm not the person you think I am. I never was." And with those words, he closed the suitcase and walked out the door, leaving Sarah alone and desolate in the living room, the life she knew falling apart around her. Tears began to stream down her face as the reality of the situation set in. She was alone, about to give birth, with no support or hope that John would return. Sarah fell to her knees, clutching her belly as silent sobs tore at her soul. The house that once symbolized love and a future now felt empty and cold, reflecting the void taking over her heart. Night fell, and with it, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She needed to start over, far from there, where no one knew her, where she could heal and raise her child in peace. She knew it would be a difficult journey, but within her, a strength began to emerge, a determination to survive and protect her child's future. Sarah drove for hours, passing through towns and villages until she finally saw the sign indicating her new home, Pineville. It was a small town, surrounded by mountains and dense forests, a place where time seemed to have stopped and the worries of the outside world were not allowed to enter. As she crossed the town's border, she felt a mix of relief and nervousness, as if she was entering a new chapter in her life. Pineville's main street was charming, with quaint shops and cozy cafes, their wooden facades painted in soft colors that conveyed a sense of welcome. Sarah parked the car in front of a small, one-story rental house she had found online. It was simple but seemed like the perfect refuge for her and her soon-to-be-born baby. While unpacking and arranging the little she had brought, Sarah felt an unexpected peace. The house had a small front garden where wildflowers grew freely and a porch where she could sit and watch the world around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could begin to heal. The days began to pass, and Sarah slowly integrated into life in Pineville. The community was small and welcoming, with people always willing to help. At the local market, she met Maggie, a kind gray-haired lady who seemed to know everyone in town. Maggie helped her find what she needed and gave her tips on the best places to visit. "You'll love the Saturday market," Maggie said with a smile. "It's the heart of our town. Everyone will be there. It's a great opportunity to meet the neighbors." Sarah thanked her and, the following Saturday, decided to follow the advice. The market was vibrant, with stalls selling fresh produce, crafts, and delicious food. Children ran and played while adults chatted and laughed. The atmosphere was contagious, and Sarah found herself genuinely smiling for the first time in months. Amid the crowd, she found a stand of used books. Browsing through the titles, she felt someone approach. "You must be the new resident," a warm voice said. Sarah turned and saw a woman her age, with a friendly smile and a baby in her arms. "I'm Emily. I live next door to you." Sarah smiled back, feeling an immediate connection. "Nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Sarah." The two chatted for a while, and Emily invited her over for coffee at her house. It was a pleasant afternoon, full of laughter and stories, and Sarah began to feel that Pineville could really be the place where she would rebuild her life. The friendship with Emily quickly deepened, offering Sarah the support and camaraderie she so desperately needed. It was a cold autumn night in Pineville. The wind blew strong, making the trees whisper ancient secrets while dry leaves danced along the road. Sarah was at home, wrapped in a thick blanket, looking out the window and reminiscing about the warmer, happier days of her life. The loneliness weighed on her like a heavy blanket, a constant reminder of what she had lost. She got up, feeling a growing restlessness in her chest, and decided to make a cup of tea to warm up. As the water boiled, Sarah heard a strange noise coming from outside. Initially, she thought it was the wind, but the sound repeated, this time louder and more urgent. It was a groan of pain. With a racing heart, she grabbed a flashlight and went out onto the porch. The yellow light cut through the darkness, revealing the gravel path leading to the forest. The sound was closer now, coming from somewhere near the entrance to her property. She followed the gravel path, the flashlight trembling in her hand as she advanced. Then she saw him. A man was lying near the fence, his body stretched out on the ground, covered in damp leaves. He was unconscious, with an expression of pain etched on his pale face. Sarah ran to him, fear and concern mingling in her heart. "Hey, are you okay? Can you hear me?" she asked, kneeling beside him. There was no response. She noticed a deep cut on his forehead and blood staining his shirt. Without thinking twice, she decided to take him inside the house. With effort, Sarah managed to put his arm around her shoulders and lift him. He was heavy, and each step was a struggle, but adrenaline gave her strength. Finally, she brought him into the living room and laid him on the sofa. With trembling hands, she cleaned the cut and did her best to stop the bleeding. As she worked, she observed his face. He had strong but gentle features, with lines suggesting a life full of challenges. Who was he? And how did he end up at her door on this cold night? Hours passed, and finally, the man began to show signs of life. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on Sarah with a mix of confusion and relief. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse and weak. "You're in my house," Sarah replied, offering him a glass of water. "I found you outside. You were injured." He accepted the water and took small sips, still trying to process what had happened. "My name is David," he finally said, his voice a bit stronger. "I'm a doctor. I was on my way home when my car skidded on the road. I think I hit something and passed out." Sarah felt a wave of compassion for him. "You were lucky I heard you," she said, smiling gently. "Rest now. Tomorrow we can talk more about what happened." David closed his eyes, exhausted, but not before murmuring a thank you. Sarah stayed by his side for a while, watching him fall asleep. The loneliness she had felt earlier seemed to have diminished a bit, replaced by a sense of purpose and unexpected connection. As the night progressed, Sarah settled into a nearby armchair, keeping watch over the stranger that fate had placed in her path. She knew this night would mark the beginning of something new, something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room where David still slept on the sofa. Sarah carefully approached him, noticing how the tranquility of his sleep softened the worry lines on his face. She felt a growing curiosity about this man who had suddenly become part of her life. David began to stir, his eyes blinking as they adjusted to the daylight. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, holding a tray with a cup of tea and some toast. "How are you feeling?" He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his side made him groan. "Still sore, but better than last night." "Thank you for helping me," he replied, accepting the cup of tea with a grateful nod. Sarah sat in a nearby chair, watching him closely. "You mentioned you're a doctor. It must be ironic to need medical help, right?" David smiled slightly, a glint of humor in his eyes. "Yes, I suppose it is. But doctors are human too, after all. And apparently, I'm a human with a lot of bad luck lately." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean by that?" He sighed, looking at the tea in his hands. "I was running away from something. From someone. Actually, my life has been complicated. And I ended up here, trying to escape." Sarah felt a deep empathy for him. "Well, you found a safe place here. Pineville is a good place to start over. The community is welcoming, and the people are kind." David nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "You're starting over too, aren't you? I can see it in you." Sarah was surprised by his perception but decided to be honest. Yes, I am. I was recently abandoned by my husband. I'm pregnant and alone. I thought a small town might be the right place to raise my child and find some peace. They sat in silence for a moment, a mutual and silent understanding growing between them. There was something comforting about sharing their pains and hopes, even if briefly. In the following days, Sarah continued to take care of David, helping him recover. She brought books from the town library for him to distract himself and cooked hot meals, which he gratefully ate. Their routine became a silent dance of kindness and gratitude, each gesture strengthening the bond forming between them. David, in turn, tried to help as much as he could despite his physical limitations. He offered medical advice, ensuring Sarah was taking proper care of herself during the pregnancy. Sometimes, he shared stories of his life before Pineville, revealing a complex man marked by difficult choices and sacrifices. One night, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, David came in, leaning slightly against the wall. "Do you need any help?" he asked, with a smile that suggested more strength than he actually had. She laughed softly. "I think you should focus on recovering first, but your company is always welcome." They sat together, talking while Sarah finished cooking. David's presence brought new energy to the house, a sense that despite the difficulties, there was hope and the possibility of renewal. Days began to turn into weeks, and David's recovery visibly progressed. Sarah and he developed a comfortable, almost familiar routine. They spent mornings together, sharing coffee and talking about life in Pineville and the small joys of everyday life. As the days grew colder, they retreated indoors, creating a small refuge from the outside world. One afternoon, as a snowstorm brewed outside, David suggested they set up the Christmas tree. Sarah hesitated for a moment, recalling the celebrations she used to have with John, but David's excitement was contagious. They went to the garage and found an artificial tree and a box of ornaments. With laughter and playful teasing, they began decorating the tree. David, still a bit weak, sat most of the time but directed Sarah with childlike enthusiasm. "That star goes on top," he insisted. "It's the most important piece." Sarah laughed, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time. "So you're a perfectionist, huh?" she teased. David smiled, placing a golden ornament on one of the lower branches. "When it comes to Christmas, definitely. My mother always said the Christmas tree had to be perfect so all our wishes would come true." The afternoon passed quickly, and the tree, though simple, looked stunning under the twinkling lights. They sat together on the sofa, admiring the result of their work. "It's beautiful," said Sarah, feeling a wave of gratitude for that moment of joy. "Yes, it is," agreed David, looking at her with an expression that mixed affection and something deeper. "Thank you for doing this with me. It's been a long time since I felt this Christmas spirit." Their closeness intensified each day. Sarah realized David was not just a guest or a friend. He was becoming an important part of her life. He was someone she could count on, someone who made her laugh and understood her pain without needing words. One night, as the snowstorm continued outside, Sarah woke up to the sound of crying. Confused, she got up and went to the living room, where she found David sitting in the dark, staring out the window. "David, are you okay?" she asked, approaching him. He quickly wiped away the tears, trying to hide his vulnerability. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you."
Just some nightmares.
Sarah sat next to him, placing a comforting hand on his. "Do you want to talk about it?" He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "My past, Sarah. The things I'm running from. Sometimes they haunt me at night." She squeezed his hand more firmly. "I'm here for you. You don't have to face it alone." David looked at her, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You've been more than a good Samaritan, Sarah. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." They sat in silence for a while, just appreciating each other's company. The storm outside was fierce, but inside the house, there was a calmness, a sense of safety and warmth that enveloped them both. The snow continued to fall silently, covering Pineville with a white, pure blanket. It was a particularly cold night, and inside Sarah's house, the fireplace crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah and David sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, enjoying the comfortable silence that only two souls in harmony could share. Sarah looked at David, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. "Are you okay?" she asked, breaking the silence. David sighed, his eyes fixed on the flames. "There's so much you don't know about me, Sarah. So much I've been trying to forget, but I can't." Sarah placed her hand over his, feeling the tension under his skin. "If you want to talk, I'm here to listen." He hesitated, but something in her eyes encouraged him to continue. "My life before coming here was full of mistakes and regrets. I was a doctor in a big city. I worked at a renowned hospital, had a promising career. But then, one mistake changed everything." She remained silent, allowing him to speak at his own pace. "I was in the middle of a complicated surgery. A 10-year-old boy, a car accident victim. We did everything we could, but he didn't survive. The boy's father was an influential, powerful man. He couldn't accept the loss and blamed me for what happened. He said I made a mistake that cost his son's life." David ran his hand over his face, as if trying to erase the painful memories. "He sued me, and the media made a spectacle of it. My reputation was destroyed. Even knowing I did everything I could, the guilt consumed me. I lost my job, my colleagues distanced themselves, and I was forced to leave the city." Sarah squeezed his hand, compassion reflected in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, David. No one should go through that. I needed to escape, Sarah. I needed a place where no one knew who I was. A place where I could start over. But the guilt and pain followed me here. Every night, I relived those moments, the decisions I made, the lives I couldn't save." She moved closer, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "You're not alone. I understand the need to start over, to seek a new beginning. And I know you did everything you could. Sometimes, life throws challenges at us that are beyond our control." David took a deep breath, feeling the comfort and security in her arms. "Thank you, Sarah. You've been a light in my darkness." They stayed like that for a while, embraced, while the snow fell outside and the fireplace crackled softly. It was a moment of vulnerability and trust, a sharing of pains that brought them closer together. At that moment, they both realized that despite the scars and secrets, there was room for healing and for the love that was beginning to blossom between them. David pulled back slightly, looking into Sarah's eyes. "I want to help you too, Sarah. I know you have your own ghosts and fears. We can face this together." She smiled, feeling a wave of hope. "Yes, we can. One step at a time." Winter in Pineville seemed endless, but David's presence made the cold days more bearable for Sarah. They had created a harmonious routine, and their connection grew stronger each day. However, the peace they had built was about to be shaken. One morning, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It was unusual to receive visitors so early, especially in such a small town. David, sitting at the kitchen table, looked up, curious. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, puzzled. "No, I'm not." She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front door. When she opened it, the shock hit her like a cold wave. There, standing on the porch, was John, her ex-husband. He looked different, thinner, his face marked by lines of fatigue, but his eyes still had that familiar determined gleam. "Sarah," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "we need to talk." For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed. All the painful memories, all the lonely nights and days of uncertainty came rushing back, but she knew she couldn't run forever. "John, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep calm. "I came to apologize," he replied, stepping forward. "I made a terrible mistake by leaving you. I thought I was doing what was best for us, but I was wrong. I want to fix things. I want to be here for you and for our child." Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions. Before she could respond, David appeared behind her, a silent reminder of the new beginning she was trying to build. "Who is he?" John asked, his eyes narrowing as he saw David. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she needed to be honest. "This is David. He has been a great support to me in the past few months." David, sensing the tension, extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, John." John ignored the extended hand, focusing only on Sarah. "Please, Sarah, can we talk alone?" She looked at David, who nodded understandingly. "I'll be in the living room if you need me," he said, discreetly withdrawing. Sarah closed the door behind her and led John to the kitchen. They sat at the table, the silence heavy between them. "Sarah," John began, "I know I hurt you deeply, but I was lost, scared. By the time I realized what I had done, it was too late. I've thought about you every day since then." She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, but also remembering the pain he had caused. "John, I've been through a lot since you left. I had to rebuild myself, learn to live alone. And now, with the baby on the way, I have to think about what's best for both of us." He nodded, tears beginning to form. "I know, and that's why I'm here. I want to be part of your life, of our child's life. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix things." Sarah felt her heart heavy. She knew forgiving John wouldn't be easy, and David's presence complicated her feelings even more. But she also knew she needed time to process everything. "John, I need time to think. Things have changed a lot since you left. I can't just pretend nothing happened." He nodded, understanding. "I get it. I'm willing to wait, to prove I can be a better person." When he stood up to leave, Sarah accompanied him to the door. "Take care, John," she said softly. He looked at her with hope. "You too, Sarah. I hope we can find a way together." After John left, Sarah stayed on the porch for a long time, looking at the snow that was starting to fall again. David joined her, offering his silent support. "That must have been hard," he said finally. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to roll down her face. "Yes, it was. But I think it needed to happen. I just hope I can make the right decision for me and the baby." David put his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I know you will, and I'll be here for whatever you need." The days following John's unexpected return were an emotional whirlwind for Sarah. Reopening old wounds she thought had healed, she also struggled with her feelings for David, whose presence was becoming increasingly essential in her life. One afternoon, as a snowstorm brewed outside, Sarah and David were in the living room. David was reading a book, but Sarah could see he was distracted. His thoughts seemed distant. She decided it was time to address the growing tension. "David, we need to talk," she said softly. He looked at her, closing the book and setting it aside. "Of course, Sarah. What's bothering you?" She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Since John came back, I feel like there's something between us that we need to clear up. I know you have your own demons, but maybe it's time we face them together." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. There's something I need to tell you, something I've been avoiding, but I can't hide it anymore." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition that something significant was coming. "What is it, David?" He stood up and began to pace the room, his hands trembling slightly. "Do you remember the boy I told you about, the patient I lost? The boy's father, the influential man who pursued me?" Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, I remember." David stopped, looking intently at her. The boy's father was John. Sarah's world seemed to collapse at that moment. "John? My John? How is that possible?" David took a deep breath, the pain evident in his eyes. "When you mentioned his name for the first time, I felt a chill, but I couldn't believe it was the same man. After doing some research, I found out it was him. When John left you, he wasn't just running away from you. He was running away from me, from the anger he felt towards me." Sarah felt the tears start to roll. The revelation was overwhelming. "This can't be true. How did we never connect the dots before?" David approached her, trying to offer comfort. "Sarah, I didn't want you to find out this way. I never imagined our paths would cross like this. But now that we know the truth, we need to face it together." She pulled away slightly, her thoughts racing. "David, this is too much to process. John came back wanting to fix things, but how can I even consider that now, knowing what I know?" David lowered his head, feeling the weight of the moment. "I understand if you need space, Sarah. I just want you to know I never wanted to hurt you. Everything that happened was a terrible coincidence." Sarah wiped away the tears, trying to regain her composure. "This changes everything, David, but it also means we need to be honest with each other and decide how to move forward." He nodded, his eyes full of regret and determination. I'm here for you, Sarah. Whatever your decision, I'll be by your side. The snowstorm outside intensified, reflecting the storm of emotions within Sarah. She knew the next steps would be crucial, not just for her but for the baby she was carrying. And as she looked at David, she saw not just the man who helped her get back on her feet, but also the man tied to the painful past she was trying to overcome. That night, Sarah stayed awake for hours, her thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. The devastating revelations left her shaken, but also strengthened her in an unexpected way. She knew she needed to face this new reality with courage and clarity and decide what was best for her future and her child's. The revelation about David and John left Sarah in an emotional turmoil she had never experienced before. The shock and pain were palpable, but the need to protect her child and make a clear decision propelled her forward. Days passed, and the snow continued to fall, creating a landscape as serene as it was deceptively calm. Inside the house, Sarah felt the weight of the choices she needed to make. David stayed close, respecting her space but always available to talk or offer support. One afternoon, while Sarah looked out the window, she saw John approaching along the snow-covered trail. He was wrapped in a heavy coat, his face marked by uncertainty. Sarah knew this conversation was inevitable and needed to happen. She opened the door before he could knock, allowing him to enter. John took off his coat, thanking her for the silent gesture. "Sarah, thank you for seeing me." She nodded, leading him to the living room. "We need to talk, John. There are a lot of things that need to be clarified." They sat down, the silence between them heavy with tension. "Sarah," John began, "I know you've discovered the truth about David. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how." She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Why did you come back, John? Why now?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and regret. "When I left you, I was running away from the pain and guilt. I thought by distancing myself, I could find peace, but I only found more despair. And then I realized that the only way to redeem myself was to face what I did and try to fix things." Sarah felt a mix of anger and compassion. "And what about David? He deserves a chance at redemption too. You blamed him for something that was beyond his control." John lowered his head, shame evident on his face. "I know, and it's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But I want to be part of your life and our child's life. I know it's asking a lot, but I'm willing to do anything to regain your trust." Before Sarah could respond, David entered the room. He had heard the conversation and knew it was time to face John directly. "John, I'm not your enemy. Everything that happened was tragic, but we need to find a way to move forward for Sarah's and the baby's sake." John looked at David, the old anger still shining in his eyes. But there was also an understanding. "I know you're not the villain, David. Pain blinded me, but I'm trying to change." Sarah looked at the two men, feeling the enormity of the decision she had before her. "I need time to think. I can't make this decision impulsively." John nodded, standing up to leave. "I understand, and I'll be here, waiting, if you decide there's a place for me in your life." David also approached, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We're all on a difficult path, but I believe we can find a solution together." After John left, Sarah stayed alone with David. They sat in silence for a while, processing the intense emotions of the encounter. Finally, Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "David, I'm so confused. I don't know what to do." He pulled her into a hug, his voice soft and comforting. "You don't have to decide now. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know I'm here for you, no matter what you choose." Winter continued its relentless reign in Pineville, covering the small town with a thick, white blanket of snow. Sarah's daily routine was an attempt at normalcy amidst the emotional chaos surrounding her. She was determined to find clarity and make the best decision for herself and her baby. One night, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table reviewing some papers, a feeling of unease began to form in her chest. David was in the living room, reading a book, and the silence of the house seemed to amplify every external sound. She tried to ignore the feeling, but something didn't seem right. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise coming from outside. Sarah and David exchanged a look, their eyes reflecting the same concern. "I'll check it out," David said, getting up quickly. Sarah followed him to the front door. When they opened it, a gust of cold wind came in, but it wasn't that which caught their attention. In the driveway, John's car lights were shining brightly, and his silhouette stood next to the vehicle, staring intently at the house. "John, what are you doing here?" Sarah called, trying to stay calm. He took a few steps forward, his features hard and determined. "We need to talk, Sarah. Now." David stepped forward, positioning himself next to Sarah. "John, this isn't the time for this. Come back tomorrow, and we'll talk calmly." John shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "No, I've reached my limit of waiting. We need to resolve this once and for all." Sarah felt the tension rise, her maternal instincts alerting her to protect the baby. "John, please, we don't need to do this way. Let's talk tomorrow." But before he could respond, a new sound cut through the night, the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. From the shadows, a man appeared, his eyes gleaming with an intent that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Who is he?" David asked, realizing the imminent threat. John looked at the man, confusion and recognition passing across his face. "James? What are you doing here?" James, an old acquaintance of John's, had a dark demeanor. "You should have thought better before running, John. You owe me, and I'm not leaving without what's mine." David and Sarah exchanged a quick look. It was evident that the situation was more serious than they had imagined. James advanced, and John tried to block his path. "James, please, we don't need to settle this way. We can negotiate." But James wasn't willing to negotiate. He pushed John hard, making him fall into the snow. David instinctively moved to protect Sarah, but James pulled out a gun, pointing it at them. "Stay where you are," he growled. "This has nothing to do with you." Sarah, with her heart racing, placed a hand on her abdomen, feeling the baby move, as if also sensing the threat. "Please, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "There's a child involved. Let's resolve this peacefully." James hesitated for a moment, his eyes darkening. "Peacefully? There's nothing peaceful about debts and betrayal." David, keeping his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, tried to appeal to James's humanity. "Listen, no one needs to get hurt here. Let's sit down and talk like adults." But before James could respond, sirens echoed in the distance, signaling the police's arrival. James looked around, realizing he was running out of time. He took a step back, still pointing the gun. "This isn't over," he warned, his eyes fixed on John. "I'll be back to settle this." With one last warning look, James disappeared into the night, leaving a trail of fear and uncertainty. John got up, his eyes filled with regret and pain. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never wanted you to be involved in this." The police arrived, and Sarah, David, and John gave their statements, explaining what had happened. The presence of the law brought some relief, but the threat still loomed in the air. As the night became silent again, Sarah knew the complications were far from over. She looked at David, who held her firmly. "We'll get through this," he promised, his voice filled with determination. The days following the confrontation with James were marked by constant tension. Sarah, David, and John were always on alert, waiting for the next move from that dangerous man. The police increased surveillance in the area, but everyone knew they would have to take their own precautions to ensure the safety of everyone, especially the baby to come. Sarah woke up every morning with a new sense of purpose. She knew she needed to be strong, not just for herself but for the child she was carrying. While winter kept Pineville in its icy grip, she prepared to face any challenge that came her way. One morning, David suggested something that would change the dynamics of their lives. "Sarah, I've been thinking. We need a solid plan to ensure James can't hurt us. We need to be ready for anything." John, sitting at the kitchen table, nodded in agreement. "David's right. We have to think about the future and how to protect you and the baby." Sarah looked at the two men in her life, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "What do you have in mind?" David pulled out a map of the city and spread it out on the table. "We need a better security system. We can install cameras around the house and motion sensors. Besides, I think we should have an evacuation plan in case things get really dangerous," John added. "And maybe we should consider temporarily moving to a safer place." My family has a cabin in the mountains, isolated and secure. We can stay there until the situation is resolved. Sarah pondered the proposal. Moving to the cabin might be a good temporary solution, but it would also mean leaving behind the life she was trying to rebuild in Pineville. What about my pregnancy? We're far from a hospital there. David smiled, trying to reassure her. I'm a doctor, remember? I'll make sure you and the baby get all the necessary care. And we can keep constant contact with the local hospital. The decision was made. In the following weeks, they worked together to prepare for the move. David installed the security systems, while John took care of the preparations for the trip to the cabin. Sarah, for her part, organized the house, making sure everything was ready for the transition. Finally, the day of departure arrived. The weather was severe, with strong winds and thick snow covering the roads. Sarah looked one last time at the house that had been her refuge, feeling a pang of sadness. But she also knew it was the right choice. During the trip, the silence in the car was filled with anticipation and concern. David drove carefully on the slippery roads, while John kept a watchful eye around, ready for any sign of danger. Sarah, sitting in the back seat, held her belly, feeling the baby move, a constant reminder of what was at stake. After hours of travel, they arrived at the cabin. It was a cozy, sturdy structure, surrounded by tall pines and an untouched snowy landscape. John opened the door, and one by one, they entered the welcoming warmth of the interior. The days at the cabin began to follow a calm but vigilant rhythm. David took care of Sarah, ensuring she was comfortable and healthy. John, for his part, reinforced security around the property, always alert for any sign of danger. One night, as the fire crackled in the fireplace, Sarah sat next to David and John. I want to thank you both. I don't know what I would do without you here. John smiled, the weight of regret still visible in his eyes. We're in this together, Sarah. We'll do whatever it takes to protect you and the baby. David agreed, holding Sarah's hand. We'll get through this together. And when this storm passes, we can finally look to the future with hope. The days in the cabin in the mountains brought a brief respite from the constant tension, but the tranquility was often interrupted by moments of reflection and difficult decisions. Sarah knew that while they were physically safe, there were emotional and relational issues that needed to be faced. One afternoon, while John was out checking the traps and reinforcing security, Sarah and David were alone in the cabin. The crackling of the fireplace provided a comforting background, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. David, Sarah began, turning to him, we need to talk about the future. I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I also need to understand where we stand. David looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty she felt. I know, Sarah, and I've been thinking a lot about it. I want to be by your side, support you and your child. But I also know that John is part of your life, and now more than ever. Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. John and I have a complicated history. He's the father of my child, and part of me wants to give him a second chance, especially now that he seems to be changing. David nodded, understanding. And I respect that. But I want you to know that my feelings for you are real. No matter what you decide, I'll be here to support you. Sarah felt the tears begin to well up. I don't want to lose you, David. You've become an important part of my life. But I also can't ignore the ties I have with John. David held her hand, offering silent comfort. We'll face this together, one step at a time. We don't have to make all the decisions now. That night, John returned, exhausted but relieved to see Sarah and David talking so honestly. Everything is safe outside, he said, placing wood in the fireplace. We need to stay vigilant, but I think we're okay for now. The three sat together, sharing a simple but warm meal. The atmosphere was charged, but there was also a sense of relief knowing they were facing the challenges head-on. The days passed, and as the snow slowly melted, the dynamics between Sarah, David, and John began to adjust. There were moments of tension, but also understanding and mutual support. They worked together to ensure everyone's safety and well-being, and this cooperation forced each of them to confront their own feelings and fears. One afternoon, while Sarah was resting in the bedroom, she heard voices coming from the living room. Curious, she got up and found David and John in a serious conversation. John, I just want the best for Sarah and the baby, David was saying, his voice calm but firm. If that means you being part of their lives, then I'll respect that. But you need to prove you've changed, that you're committed. John nodded, seeming more humble than Sarah had ever seen him. I know, David, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I've made many mistakes, but I don't want to make more. I want to be a good father and, if possible, win back Sarah's love. Sarah stood watching for a moment, feeling a wave of emotion seeing the two men in her life willing to work together for her and the baby. She entered the room, her eyes shining with determination. I know it won't be easy, she said, but I'm willing to try. We all have a painful past, but I believe we can build a better future together, somehow. The three of them looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. There was a long road ahead, full of challenges and uncertainties, but they were willing to face them together. Spring brought with it not only the promise of renewal, but also the need for final decisions. The snow had melted, and the cabin, which had been a safe haven, now seemed like a point of transition to something more definitive. Sarah knew she couldn't delay her choices any longer. Sitting on the porch, feeling the warm spring breeze, she called David and John to join her. The two men who had become central to her life appeared, their expressions reflecting a mix of hope and apprehension. The time has come, Sarah began, her voice firm but gentle. I love both of you in different ways. David, you've been my rock, my savior in moments of despair. John, you're the father of my child, and I see in you a genuine desire for change and redemption. David and John remained silent, listening attentively as she spoke. I've thought a lot about the future, not just mine but our child's. And I've realized that to move forward, I need to make a decision that brings peace to all of us. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. David, I choose you. You brought light during one of the darkest periods of my life, and I want to build a future with you. John, I want you to be part of our child's life, but as a friend, a partner in care and upbringing. John lowered his head, accepting the decision with a maturity Sarah had never seen before. I understand, Sarah, and I'll respect your decision. I promise to be the best father possible and support you and David on this new journey. David held Sarah's hand, relief and happiness evident in his eyes. We'll do this together, Sarah. We'll build the life you and the baby deserve. As the three of them hugged, a feeling of resolution and hope enveloped the cabin. The future was still uncertain, but there was a clear path ahead, a path of love, understanding, and new possibilities. And so, in the heart of spring, with nature blooming around them, Sarah, David, and John found a new beginning, each accepting their role in the future they were ready to build together. And then, suddenly, a loud knock on the door interrupted the moment. They looked at each other, surprised and curious. Who could it be? When Sarah opened the door, a familiar but unexpected face smiled at her. Sarah, is that you? She blinked, astonished. Mom,